So I already said this morning that Christmas is just 6 days away. Hopefully you're not one of those who waits until the last minute, but sometimes things happen too, believe me. Sometimes you order something online and it gets delivered to the wrong address, and then you fight with the post office and you fight with this and that and still can't get it, and then they say, oh, it might be here on Christmas Eve if you're fortunate. So things like that happen, just think about your gift-giving habits, for one thing. What determines what you choose to get for another person? Also, what determines if you choose to get a specific person a gift or not? You may select a gift out of love for that person. For instance, what I choose for my wife or my mother is more of a loving gift, whereas if I get my boss something, it might not be so much chosen out of love, but maybe practicality or something like that. So every situation is unique and special. And to me, that's what adds to the excitement of the holiday season too. So this morning we're going to finish this look at gifts that we see in the Bible. And we have not looked at every instance of the word gift. This is just a sampling for sure. But in the first 3 messages, it's always good to go back and see where we have come from to understand and appreciate where we are going. So we looked at different things that the Bible refers to as the gift of God. And when it says of God, it means from God. So gifts from God to us. And we looked at gifts. Today we're going to look at gifts that we can offer to God. And some specific gifts that were offered to God in a very special situation. Now, when you think of gifts to God, you can think of things like the tithes and the offerings. It's a gift that we give back to God. And if you read through the Old Testament, some of the real technical books that honestly aren't very exciting, but they're still important, they detail all of these different Old Testament offerings that the people were to make to God as well. So they are also viewed as gifts to God. This morning we're going to look at the wise men, the Magi. And these are the men who came from the east to the house of Joseph and Mary. They came to worship Jesus, and also they offered gifts to him. They opened up their treasures and presented gifts to the Christ child. So we will read what the Bible has to say about their efforts in Matthew 2, reading the first 12 verses that, if you are following in your Pew Bible, is on 681. It's one of those pages where you don't see the actual page number there. But beginning in Matthew 2, verse 1, it says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.' When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ child was to be born. 'In Bethlehem in Judea,' they replied, 'for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel.' Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him.' After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Now, the Bible really doesn't tell us an awful lot about these wise men, about these people that we call magi. Most of what we know comes from history and a little bit of what we know of the culture of the day too. So we sort of make some conjecture about where they might have come from, how far they went, and those kind of things. I have seen broad estimates that say at the shortest they may have traveled 400 miles to get to the house of Mary and Joseph. Others say it could have been as far as 800 or more miles. So that's a big range too, depending on where they came from. And even at the shortest, if you are taking a 400-mile trip anywhere, you're going to want to double and triple check to make sure that you have everything when you're packing ready to go. So since they're traveling a long way to see a king, well, these magi knew that it was only appropriate to offer gifts as well. And it's not just this scenario that we see this to this day also. So, of course, in other words, it's not something where you're going to stop at the dollar store at the last minute and throw something in a gift bag to give to a king. So they put thought into this clearly. And it's customary to present gifts to esteemed individuals even today. It's like every now and then you'll see on the news where the president goes and meets with the Queen of England. And when they do that, it's customary for each to offer a gift to the other. And then the people on the news are all abuzz about the appropriateness of the gift and if it's elegant enough. And they try to, do what news people do, basically make a story where there might not be any, that kind of stuff. But they want to make sure that it's acceptable by high-class standards. So these magi, of course, they went and they were not empty-handed. And a lot has been written about the gifts that they brought. And I have not read a scholar yet who thinks that these gifts were chosen completely by random. And that makes sense. And in hindsight, we can see maybe a little more symbolism and practicality than maybe was originally intended, but that's more conjecture too. But taking them in order, first, gold seems pretty obvious. Gold is a gift fit for a king, so that makes sense. The King James Version puts it as frankincense, or NIV, incense, same thing. That's what we're talking about. And that refers to a high priest who would burn this and offer up their prayers to God. So Jesus is the high priest, of course. So that gift made sense as well. And then the third is myrrh, which is an embalming agent. Now this is the odd one. I've never, seen a lot of babies being born, never saw anyone give them a jar of embalming fluid. So that one might need a little bit of explanation here. But we can see the symbolism looking back with the benefit of 2,000 years. And we didn't even need 2,000 years to understand how that was symbolic, because it was Jesus' redemptive nature. He was born to die, so he was given myrrh. And I'm not even sure if the Magi chose these gifts because they thought they were symbolic. We're not really sure what specifically they knew about this Christ child and what he would do, because the Bible just doesn't tell us, so we just don't have any evidence. It seems pretty obvious and practical that the gifts were valuable in the land that the Magi came from, so they assumed that it would be valuable to the person that they gave it to. But that is what I think makes the story so remarkable, that from the perspective of the Magi, that might have been all there was to it. But we can see how God used these gifts in extraordinary ways that I'm pretty sure the Magi had no idea they would have been used in the way that they probably were. Now, It involves a little more reading between the lines here in the scriptures, but not long after the visit, Joseph and Mary, they had to flee to Egypt to avoid Herod's edict of having all young boys being killed. So we do know for a fact Mary and Joseph were very poor. So the question is, if not for those gifts of the Magi, how do you suppose they would have afforded such a trip to Egypt? It's quite possible they may not have been able to do that. But in God's providence, the Magi gave them gold. Well, you can buy stuff with gold, so that probably came in very helpful. And maybe once the gold was gone, the incense or the frankincense, well, that could be traded and bartered for more goods. And myrrh, that was highly sought after in Egypt, the place they were going. So it is quite conceivable that they may have used and traded and bartered these gifts to finance this trip. And if that is the case, which seems highly likely, then these gifts of the Magi literally saved Jesus' life, if you think about it that way. So there's no reason to believe that the Magi would have suspected all of this might have happened and that these gifts would have been used in such an extraordinary way. I just can't conceive that they would know that Mary and Joseph would have to go on an unplanned trip so far into Egypt, and it would be expensive, and these gifts would have been exactly what they needed for that. So, no, I don't really believe that it's any kind of coincidence. It is nothing short of God working in the lives of people who are unaware of what's going on behind the scenes. And it's just everything falling into place and people being made aware of it and noticing it after the fact. Have you ever seen that happen in your life before? Maybe not quite a life and death situation, but maybe it's in your life or the life of someone close. Maybe somebody did something for you or gave you something, and maybe at the time it seemed really insignificant. You really didn't think much of it, but later that act or that thing they gave you made all the difference in the world. The point we don't want to miss is that God gives us gifts so we can use the gifts for his glory. So I want to ask you this morning, what are your gifts? What has God given you, talent-wise, otherwise, that you can use to further the gospel? I always can go back to Billy Graham for a good example, because he lived an amazing life and did a lot of good for the gospel. God set Billy up to do great things. He had this booming voice. He had infectious personality. And more importantly, God gave him a heart for the lost too, to reach people for the gospel. So he is a great example of how God can set people up for success. But the thing is, Billy had a choice all through his life. He could either use the gifts for God's glory, or he could keep it to himself. He could do something else if he wanted. So much of it hinges on our obedience too. The wise men had expensive gifts. They could have kept them for themselves. They could have given something less expensive to the Christ child. They could have, but they didn't for whatever reason. The same way that Billy Graham had a choice whether or not to use the gifts God gave him. The same goes with us too. That God gives us gifts and sometimes we may not even know that we have these gifts until we really sit down and pray about it and think about it too. So you might be thinking, well, maybe I work in a retail store. Where's the gift in that? Or I drive a truck all day. Where's the gift in that? Or I work in an office with, just a bunch of other people who keep to themselves. Where is the gift in that? I can't speak to everybody's specific situation, but I do know that everybody has something in your life that you can use to glorify God. If you aren't sure what your gift is, and it's nothing to be ashamed or embarrassed about, you simply pray and you ask God for it. And if you're really serious about it, ask somebody else in church, will you pray for me? And can we pray together maybe? And maybe God will tell you to tell me. Or if you're really serious, you're going to do whatever it takes to find out what that is. Because once you know, then that's the hard part. Then it is just following God's lead and doing what he wants you to do with that gift. I'm reminded of Moses in the Old Testament. Moses was up on the mountain with God, and he took a staff up there. Typically, every guy back then had a staff they walked with. If you were out in the fields with the sheep, of course. And Moses is up there more or less telling God why he can't do what God told him to do. And it's interesting that this great man of faith is in this situation saying, God, I know you want me to talk to these people, but I have this stuttering problem. And I'm not sure if you remember that, God, but I'm not at the top of the list of public speakers here. And then Moses says, then the next thing, well, what am I going to do when they ask me for proof that you sent me? Who are you? What's your name? And that's when God says, tell them I am sent me. And hopefully you know the rest of that story. And basically, Moses is making every excuse that he can to be disobedient to God. And do you remember the point in the story where God says, Moses, you're right, I forgot, you can't speak well, and these people aren't going to follow you and all that? You don't remember that part because it's not there. Because God didn't say that. God did not apologize for setting him up for failure. If anything, God gave him what he needed to do the job. God did so by saying, what is that in your hand? And I love how God asks very obvious questions. He does that all the time. And what, of course, was in his hand was the staff. And it's the same staff that was used to part the Red Sea. It's the same staff that Moses threw on the ground and it became a snake. And it's the same staff that he used to strike a rock and get water from. So it was just an ordinary staff, but God says, what's that in your hand? That's a staff. So God says, in so many words, I'm going to take your ordinary, everyday staff that I have given you, and I'm going to make it extraordinary. And that's what God does all the time. So we might not think about routine things in our lives being that important, and we might not know how they are going to be used in the future for his glory, but we can't discount those routine things either, because God specializes in taking the ordinary and making them extraordinary. That's what he does with Christians, by the way. When we first become saved, we are ordinary people, and he makes us into something extraordinary. And no matter what it is, whether it's a certain ability or a talent you have, or maybe just a really good infectious personality, or maybe even God has blessed you with some extra finances that are over and above what you actually need to survive, that you can donate, whatever it is, God's given you all of that stuff first. And so this is the important point that I really hope you take with you today, is that God never asked us to give more to him than what he has already provided us with. So this message is the fourth and the last in the 4-message series, and hopefully to get the most out of it, it's sort of a summary of what has come before. If you remember 3 weeks ago in Ecclesiastes 3, Solomon talks about finding satisfaction in your work and being happy, and that's a gift of God. And in Ephesians 2, the next week, Paul says that salvation is a gift of God. And last week in Romans 6, Paul writes that eternal life is a gift of God too. And today we look at how we can then take gifts and give back to God. So if you are a Christian who is living a joyful life because you find satisfaction in what God has for you to do, and you know that you're saved and you are responding to God's call in your life, like Paul writes in Ephesians 2, well, that means you have something to look forward to, and that is eternal life with God, which conveniently Paul then writes about in Romans 6, about salvation too. And so the reverse also is true as well. If you don't take satisfaction in your life because you aren't saved and because you aren't a giving person, maybe you know people like this, they're just sort of grouchy and selfish and self-centered and don't really care for giving much to other people, well, that's something that they need to address for sure and come to Christ humbly. But like the Magi, we need to keep our eyes on the things above and be ready to give back to God the things that He requires. So if you're like millions of other people, this week you will probably give a gift to another person. But I do ask you, like the Magi, what gifts are you planning to give to God? And not everyone is like the Magi who can afford such elaborate, expensive gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but it doesn't matter. They gave what they had to God. And actually, I need to qualify that and change that. They didn't give just what they had. They gave the best of what they had to God. And it really is an insult whenever we do not give God the best that we have, because He's been so gracious to give us to us abundantly. So here's something to think about. Have you ever, maybe never intentionally, hopefully, but insulted someone by giving them a gift? Maybe you thought it was a good gift, like, sorry guys, if you give an appliance to your wife or your girlfriend or something for Christmas, utensils, something like that. Oh, she's going to love this knife set. Nothing against knife sets, by the way. And there may be women out there who need a knife set, and they say, hey, can you get me this? But don't go out on your own and get a knife set if she doesn't ask for it. You can ruin Christmas by your gift decision. It is possible, and I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But it's about the gift being appropriate for the person and for the situation and so forth. So I mentioned earlier, I give different types of gifts. Give a certain type of gift to my wife, different type to my mother, different type to my children, and different type to my boss. So different relationships demand different kinds of gifts. And so it goes back to God, though. What is an appropriate gift to give to God? God's given us His best, so all I can say generally is for us to give our best back to Him. So I want to close shortly here by saying that I hope you will all take time out of your schedules this week. It does get busy. It's the nature of Christmas in America, I guess. But just take time out and consider the gifts that God's given you and consider what you normally give back to God. And if there's a bit of a disconnect there, just start one day and make an effort to give Him your best. And once you've done it one time, that's the hard part. And the next time, do it again. And the next day, do it again, and so forth. Because God gave us His best in Jesus, who taught us great things, healed people, performed miracles, and best of all, took our punishment for us. That is the best that He could give to us. So again, I just hope that you'll consider what gifts you're giving to God. I hope that they are appropriate and God-honoring, because really nothing else pleases God any more than seeing His children walking in His ways and following His leads. So all we have to do is just use what He has given us in the first place. Let's close with a word of prayer.